NASCAR in 1968 was already running at speeds that most racetracks weren't built to handle. Cars were hitting 190 miles per hour on the long straightaways. Lap averages were climbing past what the tire compounds could safely sustain. And the aerodynamics of the cars in competition had become more important than the engines underneath them. If your car didn't cut through the air cleanly at those speeds, the engine didn't matter. You were just a very expensive air brake. Then Chrysler looked at the wind tunnel data from their standard Dodge Charger and found something that should have been obvious. The roof was creating a massive lift pocket at high speed. The rear window's fast back angle was separating the airflow and turning the entire rear of the car into a parachute. At 190 miles per hour, the Charger was aerodynamically invisible, and not in a good way. It was generating drag numbers that made Ford's engineers laugh. What followed was a 2-year engineering war between the two biggest manufacturers in American motorsport, conducted entirely in the wind tunnel and settled on the superspeedways. Chrysler built a car with a nose cone the length of a kitchen counter and a rear wing taller than most drivers. Ford built a car so slippery that engineers described it as the first NASCAR stock car that actually wanted to go fast. Both manufacturers built just enough of these cars to homologate them for competition, and then NASCAR banned both of them before the next season was over. This is the Dodge Daytona versus the Ford Talladega, the aero war that changed what NASCAR cars look like to this day, and the two most extreme vehicles you could walk into a dealership and buy. Chrysler's aerodynamic problem became undeniable during the 1968 season. Their Dodge Charger, which looked dramatic and aggressive in a parking lot, was a disaster at speed. The recessed grille created a low-pressure pocket that destabilized the front end. The flying buttress C-pillars on the fastback roofline generated massive turbulence that pulled the rear of the car upward at high speed. Wind tunnel analysis showed the Charger had a drag coefficient that meant Ford's Torino, with a less powerful engine, was simply faster on the superspeedways where lap speeds determined championships. Chrysler's engineering response was the Charger 500, a modified production Charger with a flush grille replacing the recessed unit and a modified rear window that sat flush with the body instead of angling backward with that damaging gap. Simple fixes, but the rules required Chrysler to build 500 production units to homologate the changes. They did exactly that. The Charger 500 went on sale, became a genuine collector car before anyone knew what collector cars were, and solved approximately half of the aerodynamic problem. It was not enough. Ford's Torino was still faster on the big ovals. Chrysler went back to the wind tunnel. Ford's aero program had a simpler starting point. The Torino's fastback roofline was already cleaner than the Charger's. But Ford's engineers identified two primary sources of drag: the front end's blunt nose and the door seams that interrupted the car's surface at high speed. The solution to both problems was precision metalwork. The Torino Talladega, named pointedly after the Alabama superspeedway Chrysler had claimed as their home track, got a completely reshaped front end. The nose was stretched 3 inches and given a precise slope that minimized the frontal cross-section. The leading edge of the rocker panels was rolled under to reduce turbulence. The door seams were flush welded, the production seam eliminated, and the surface finished smooth so airflow could travel the length of the car without interruption. The rear bumper was reversed to reduce the air pocket behind the car. The result was a car that, in NASCAR trim, was clocking nearly 190 miles per hour at tracks that hadn't seen those speeds before. Ford needed 754 production units for homologation. They built them, sold them through dealers to customers who understood they were buying a piece of racing history, and sent their factory teams to Daytona, Talladega, and the other superspeedways with David Pearson, Leeroy Yarbrough, and Cale Yarborough behind the wheel. The engine underneath all of this was the 428 Cobra Jet, Ford's revised big block that replaced the 427 after the engine wars of the mid-1960s. Factory rating: 335 horsepower. Nobody believed that number either. The Cobra Jet made 335 horsepower at the factory rating point, and considerably more at any RPM above it. In NASCAR trim with the proper carburation and exhaust, these engines were producing 600 horsepower or more, while technically sharing a model designation with engines you could order in a street Mustang. Chrysler saw the Talladega's wind tunnel numbers and understood immediately that the Charger 500's modest revisions weren't going to be enough. The front-end aerodynamics were manageable. The rear end was still generating lift that was genuinely dangerous at 190+ miles an hour. The car wanted to fly. Chrysler's solution was not subtle. The Dodge Daytona was built around the most dramatic aerodynamic appendages ever installed on a production-homologated American car. The nose cone extended 18 inches ahead of the standard Charger's front bumper, so far forward that it required a new hood with a raised section to clear the cone's mounting structure and flip-up headlight covers to maintain the clean leading edge. Wind tunnel data showed the extended nose reduced drag by a margin that was worth multiple seconds per lap at superspeedway speeds. The rear wing was the part that made people stop walking and stare. A massive stabilizer, 23 inches above the trunk lid on uprights bolted directly through the bodywork, that generated downforce at high speed and eliminated the rear lift that had been destabilizing the Charger. The wing was high enough that the trunk could still open underneath it, high enough that most garage doors in America would have been a problem, high enough that Dodge's engineers were forced to explain to NASCAR's rulebook writers why a road car needed an airplane part on its roof. Chrysler built 503 Daytona units for homologation. The engine options were the 440 Magnum at 375 horsepower or the 426 Hemi at 425, both numbers carrying the same asterisk that applied to every Mopar performance rating of the era. The real output of the Hemi Daytona in full NASCAR trim was something the engineers knew and the rulebook didn't ask about. The Talladega Superspeedway opened in September 1969. The longest and fastest paved oval in the world, at 2.66 miles. The first race run on that track became the opening battle of the Aero War at full scale. Charlie Glotzbach qualified the Daytona at 199.466 miles per hour. Richard Brickhouse won the race in a Daytona after Richard Petty walked out of the event over a union dispute with the track, and most of the established stars followed him. The fastest production-based car in American racing history was winning at a track that had existed for exactly one race. Over the 1969 season, the Talladega, with Pearson and Yarbrough driving, won 26 races across the NASCAR schedule. The Daytona, arriving later in the season with less time to develop, still won where it ran. Both cars were making every other vehicle on the superspeedways look slow by comparison. Ford's aerodynamic program had been executed perfectly. Chrysler's had been executed even better. The problem was that both programs had been executed too well. Bobby Isaac took a Daytona to a closed-course speed record of 201.104 miles per hour at Talladega in November 1970, a record that stood for a decade. That number was achieved by a car whose body had first appeared in a Chrysler dealer showroom 18 months earlier. It was a production car. It had a VIN number. Someone's grandmother could have bought one. NASCAR banned both cars before the 1970 season opened. The rule was written carefully to avoid directly naming either vehicle. Cars with rear wings or nose extensions would be required to run restrictor plates if their engines displaced more than 430 cubic inches. Since both cars ran engines well above that threshold, the ruling effectively outlawed their unrestricted performance. The Daytona and Superbird, Plymouth's 1970 version built for Richard Petty, could still race, but with plates choking their airflow down to speeds that erased the aerodynamic advantage that made them worth building. Chrysler read the new rules, calculated the performance deficit the restrictor plates imposed, and concluded that the 1971 Charger, with aerodynamic revisions that improved on the standard car without the controversial appendages, was more competitive than a restricted Daytona. The Superbird was gone after one season. Petty switched to Plymouth's conventional cars and kept winning. The wing cars became curiosities within 2 years of their debut. On the street, the performance delta between these two cars was less about aerodynamics and more about what was under the hood. The Talladega with the 428 Cobra Jet consistently ran the quarter mile in the 14-second range at around 100 miles per hour in factory stock trim. Respectable performance, but not spectacular by the standards of dedicated muscle cars. The Cobra Jet made most of its power in the mid-range, and the Talladega's suspension setup was tuned for oval racing stability rather than drag strip launch control. The Daytona with the 440 Magnum ran in the 13.6 to 13.8 range at 104 to 106 miles per hour. Add the 426 Hemi, and you were in the 13-second zone in factory stock trim, with the understanding that a properly prepared Hemi car could crack 12 seconds without modifying anything the factory hadn't intended. The Hemi Daytona was not a track day toy. It was a functioning race car with a nose the length of a coffee table and a wing that could be seen over the roof of most parking garages. Both cars are worth serious money today. A low-mileage Talladega in original condition commands $200,000 to $400,000 at auction, more for documented race team examples. A Hemi Daytona in comparable condition has traded for over $900,000. The cars that NASCAR banned as too extreme have become the most valuable NASCAR homologation specials ever produced. The aero war they started never fully ended. NASCAR spent the next 50 years managing the relationship between aerodynamics and speed, adding restrictor plates, introducing plate racing rules, and eventually designing spec body templates that controlled drag coefficients across every competing manufacturer. Every rule written to slow cars down at Daytona and Talladega traces directly back to the winter of 1969, when two manufacturers looked at what the other one was building and decided the only rational response was to build something even more extreme. You could buy both of these cars at a dealership. That was the point. That was the rule. And what two manufacturers produced when they were forced to sell their race car engineering to the general public turned out to be the most aerodynamically radical vehicles ever to carry American production car window stickers.